the stagecoach that rattled into Willow Creek, Montana territory, on the first hot morning of June 1882, was carrying a woman who had already decided, 300 miles back, that she would not be turned away. Harriet Keller stepped down from the coach with her carpet bag in one hand and a folded letter in the other, and she looked at the dusty little town the way a general looks at a battlefield she intends to win. Willow Creek was not much to look at: a single rutted street, a mercantile, a livery, a squat little church with a bell that had cracked 2 winters back, and a saloon that doubled as the only place a traveler could get a hot meal. But Harriet had not come 300 miles for the scenery. She had come for a man named Wallace Barnett, and she meant to marry him. She found him within the hour, because Willow Creek was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody's business, and the boy who ran messages for the livery pointed her toward the Barnett ranch without being asked twice, grinning the whole while as though he already knew how this particular story was going to go. The ranch sat at the base of a low ridge, 4 miles out from town, with a weathered house and a big barn and corrals full of horses that moved like poured water in the morning light. Harriet walked the last half-mile because the liveryman would not spare a horse for a stranger, and by the time she reached the porch her boots were gray with dust and her bonnet had slipped half off her head, and she did not care one bit. Wallace Barnett was standing in the yard with a rope in his hands, working a green colt that did not want to be worked, and when he saw her coming up the path he went still in a way that told Harriet immediately that he already knew who she was and why she had come. "You're Wallace Barnett," she said, because she liked to start conversations by stating the obvious, so that no one could accuse her later of pretending otherwise. "I am," he said, and nothing more. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been out in the weather too many years and a jaw that looked like it had never once considered relaxing. His eyes were a pale gray-blue, the color of a sky before a storm, and they studied her now with the particular wariness of a man watching something he suspects is going to cause him trouble. "I am Harriet Keller," she said. "I believe you have been expecting me." "I have not," Wallace said. "I have been dreading you." Harriet laughed because she could not help it, and because she had already decided that laughing was going to serve her better than crying, no matter how this went. "Well, that is a fine way to greet a lady who has traveled clear from St. Louis. You should not have come. I wrote to say I was coming. I received a letter in return, signed with your name, telling me the 11th of June would suit fine and that you would meet the coach. I did not send that letter." Harriet had suspected as much, somewhere around Nebraska, when the tone of the second letter had shifted so strangely from the first, warmer, softer, full of little jokes that did not match the clipped sentences that had come before. But suspecting a thing and having it confirmed to your face by a man who looked as though he would rather wrestle a mountain lion than continue this conversation were 2 very different experiences. "Then who did?" Wallace's jaw worked for a moment before he answered. "My sister, Eleanor. She has some notion that I need a wife, and she has decided to arrange one for me the way she would order a plow from a catalog. I am not a plow, Mr. Barnett." "No," he said, looking at her carpet bag and her travel-stained dress and the stubborn set of her chin. "You are worse. A plow does not talk back." Harriet set her bag down in the dirt because her arm was tired, and because she wanted him to understand that she was not leaving in the next 5 minutes no matter how rude he chose to be. "I have spent 11 days on trains and coaches to get here, Mr. Barnett. I gave up a position teaching school in St. Louis to come. I do not intend to turn around and go home simply because you have decided to be disagreeable about a matter your own sister arranged. Then you can turn around and be disagreeable on your own coach fare, because I have no use for a wife, arranged or otherwise." He turned back to the colt as though the conversation were finished, and that was the moment Harriet understood something important about Wallace Barnett. He expected people to leave when he turned his back on them. He expected it the way other men expected the sun to rise, and Harriet decided, right there in the dust of his yard, that she was going to be the first person in a very long while who did not oblige him. "I will be staying in town," she said to his back. "At the boarding house, I expect, if there is one." "There is." "Good. Then I will not have far to walk when I come out to remind you that you have not seen the last of me." Wallace did not turn around, but Harriet saw his shoulders go rigid, and she took that as a small victory, and she picked up her carpet bag and walked the 4 miles back to town with a spring in her step that the heat and the dust could not entirely dampen. The boarding house was run by a wiry, sharp-eyed widow named Ruth Calloway, who took one look at Harriet's dusty hem and travel-worn face and said, "You're the one who came for Barnett," before Harriet had even given her name. "How does everyone in this town already know that?" "Eleanor Barnett wrote her intentions to half the county before she wrote to you, I expect," Ruth said, showing her up a narrow staircase to a small room with a washstand and a quilt that smelled of lavender. "She's been trying to marry that man off for 3 years. He buried his mother and father inside of one bad winter, and his younger brother went off to fight the Nez Perce troubles back in '77 and never came home, and ever since, Eleanor's been convinced her brother is going to rot out there on that ranch alone if somebody doesn't do something about it." Harriet sat down on the edge of the bed, the fatigue of 11 days of travel finally catching up to her. "And Mr. Barnett does not wish to be done something about." "Mr. Barnett," Ruth said, with the dry amusement of a woman who had watched a great many foolish things happen in her town, "does not wish to be spoken to before noon, does not wish to attend church suppers, does not wish to sell his north pasture to Silas Grant no matter how much money the man waves at him, and most certainly does not wish for a wife he did not choose himself. But I will say this, Miss Keller. In 3 years of watching every marriageable woman between here and Helena try her hand at that man, you are the first one who walked back into town smiling instead of crying." "I do not intend to cry over Wallace Barnett," Harriet said. "I intend to make him regret every rude word he has said to me." Ruth laughed, a real laugh from the belly. "Well then, you had best get some sleep, because that man is about as easy to move as a boulder, and boulders do not care how loud you shout at them." "I have moved boulders before," Harriet said, and she meant it. Her father had been a stubborn man too, before the influenza took him, and her mother had spent 30 years proving that patience, applied steadily and without apology, could wear down even the hardest stone. That night Harriet lay in the narrow bed listening to the wind move through the cottonwoods outside her window, and she thought about the look on Wallace Barnett's face when he had told her she should not have come, not anger, not really, but something older and sadder than anger, something that lived underneath the gruffness the way a fire lives underneath ash. She had seen grief before. She recognized its shape even when it was wearing a scowl. And though she would not have admitted it to Ruth Calloway, or to anyone, the sight of it had settled something in her, some determination that went beyond mere stubbornness. She had come to Willow Creek because a letter had promised her a husband. She decided that first night that she would stay because a man needed someone willing to see past the wall he had built, brick by brick, out of every loss he had ever suffered. She took a position the following week helping Ruth Calloway in the boarding house kitchen, in exchange for her room, and she took in mending from the townsfolk to earn a little extra. And within a month, everyone in Willow Creek had grown accustomed to the sight of Harriet Keller, walking the 4 miles out to the Barnett ranch 2 or 3 times a week, carrying a basket of something bread, or stew, or a mended shirt she had taken in without being asked, and leaving it on the porch whether Wallace Barnett wanted it or not. "You do not have to keep coming out here," he told her, the 4th time, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed like a man guarding a fort. "I know I do not have to," Harriet said, setting the basket down on the step. "I want to. There is a difference, Mr. Barnett, though I understand it might have been a long while since anyone did anything for you simply because they wanted to." He did not answer that, but he also did not throw the basket into the yard, which Harriet counted as progress. "I brought you a pie," she said. "Dried apple." I do not know if you like dried apple pie, but I made it anyway because a man who lives alone out here probably has not had a decent pie in some time, and everybody deserves pie now and then, whether they have earned it or not. I did not ask for pie. No, Harriet agreed. You did not. That is rather the point of a gift, Mr. Barnett. If you had to ask for it, it would hardly be worth giving. She left before he could argue further, because she had learned already that Wallace Barnett needed the last word almost as much as he needed air, and she had decided it cost her nothing to let him have it, so long as he ate the pie. He ate the pie. She found the tin, scrubbed clean, sitting on the porch rail the next time she came, and though he said not one word about it, Harriet smiled the whole walk back to town. Summer deepened over Willow Creek, and Harriet settled into the rhythms of the town, the way water settles into a riverbed, finding all the low places and filling them without seeming to try. She taught 3 of the town's children their letters in the afternoons when the schoolteacher took ill. She organized a supper to raise funds for a new church bell. She argued with the mercantile owner about the price of flour until he lowered it out of sheer exhaustion, and she went on walking out to the Barnett ranch, rain or shine, with her basket and her stubborn good humor. Wallace Barnett, for his part, went on being gruff and quiet and impossible, in exactly the manner Harriet had come to expect. He answered her in as few words as he could manage. He scowled when she talked too much, which was often, because Harriet had never in her life believed that silence improved a conversation. He told her more than once that she was wasting her time, that he had no intention of marrying anyone, arranged or otherwise, and that she would do better to go find some other man in some other town who wanted a wife. But he kept eating her pies. He kept the mended shirts. And one afternoon in late July, when Harriet arrived to find him favoring his left leg badly after a young stallion had thrown him against the corral fence, he let her clean the cut on his temple and bind the sprain in his ankle without so much as a single complaint, which from Wallace Barnett was practically a declaration of undying affection. "You should have a doctor look at this," Harriet said, wrapping a strip of clean linen around his ankle while he sat rigid on an overturned crate in the barn, jaw clenched against the pain he refused to acknowledge aloud. "Doctors in Bozeman, half a day's ride. Then I suppose I shall have to do. You are not a doctor." "No," Harriet agreed, tying off the linen with a firm knot, "but I raised 4 younger brothers, and I have set more sprained ankles and split lips than most doctors see in a year, so you will simply have to trust my judgment, Mr. Barnett, whether you like it or not." He was quiet for a long moment, watching her work with those pale, storm-colored eyes, and when he finally spoke his voice had lost some of its usual edge. "Why do you keep coming out here?" Harriet looked up at him, surprised by the question, because in 2 months he had never once asked her that directly. "Because you need someone to, and because I said I would. I never asked you to stay." "No," she said, "but you never told me to go either. Not really. Not in a way you meant." Something flickered across his face then, something that was not quite a smile but was close enough kin to one that Harriet's heart gave an unexpected lurch in her chest. "You are the most stubborn woman I have ever met." "I have been told that before," Harriet said, gathering her supplies back into her basket, "usually by men who were far less stubborn than they believed themselves to be." That autumn, trouble came to Willow Creek in the shape of a man named Silas Grant, who owned the largest spread in the valley and wanted a larger one still, and who had set his sights on the water rights that ran through Wallace Barnett's north pasture. Grant had already bought out 2 smaller ranchers that year, offering prices that seemed generous until a man understood that refusing them tended to result in fences cut, cattle scattered, and wells mysteriously fouled. Wallace had refused Grant's offer 3 times already, and everyone in town knew it. And everyone in town also knew that Silas Grant was not a man who took refusal well. Harriet heard about the trouble from Ruth Calloway, who heard it from her cousin who worked at the mercantile, who heard it from one of Grant's own hired men, who had gotten drunk enough one evening to complain that his boss was fixing to squeeze Barnett out one way or another before the snow came. "You ought to warn him," Ruth said, over the wash basin they were sharing that evening. "Grant is not a man who plays fair." "I intend to," Harriet said, already reaching for her shawl. "Though I do not expect he will thank me for the interference." She walked out to the ranch in the last gray light of evening, arriving just as Wallace was closing up the barn for the night, and she found him in no mood for company, his face drawn tight with the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent the day mending fence that should not have needed mending. "Silas Grant cut your east fence again," she said, before he could tell her to go home, because she had learned that the fastest way through Wallace Barnett's gruffness was simply to go around it. "How do you know that?" "The whole town knows it, Wallace. You cannot keep trouble like this to yourself out here, no matter how much you might prefer to." It was the first time she had called him by his given name, and she saw him notice it, saw something shift behind those storm-gray eyes, though he said nothing about it directly. "It is my trouble to handle," he said instead. "It is your trouble," Harriet agreed, "but that does not mean you have to handle it alone. There is a difference, though I begin to think no one has ever properly explained it to you." "I do not need explaining to. I have managed on my own since my father died. I do not need a woman from St. Louis telling me how to run my ranch." Harriet felt the sting of that, sharper than she expected, but she did not let it show on her face, because she had decided months ago that she would not give Wallace Barnett the satisfaction of watching his words land. "I am not telling you how to run your ranch, Wallace. I am telling you that a man alone against Silas Grant is a man who is going to lose, and I happen to think you deserve better than losing, whether you believe that about yourself or not." He stared at her for a long moment, and something in his face cracked just slightly, just enough for Harriet to glimpse the tiredness underneath, the years of carrying every burden by himself because there had never been anyone left to share the weight. "My brother used to say things like that," he said finally, quietly, the words coming out rough, as though they had been buried a long time and did not come easily to the surface. "About not being alone. He believed that sort of thing. Went off to fight in '77 still believing it. What happened to him? He did not come home." Wallace's voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a man who had said these words to himself so many times that they had worn smooth, like river stones. "Buried an empty coffin beside my mother and father because there was nothing else to bury. That was 5 years ago. I have run this ranch alone ever since, and I have done fine." "You have survived," Harriet said gently. "That is not quite the same thing as fine, Wallace, and I think you know it." He did not answer that, but he did not tell her to leave either, and when she left an hour later after helping him carry water for the horses and mend a broken hinge on the tack room door, he walked her partway down the road toward town, further than he had ever walked with her before, and at the fork where their paths separated he said, so quietly she almost missed it, "Thank you for coming." It was not much. It was, in fact, the smallest possible thing a man could say. But Harriet carried those 4 words back to town like a lantern against the dark, and she slept better that night than she had in weeks. The trouble with Silas Grant came to a head in the first week of September, on a night when the wind was blowing hard out of the northwest, and the air smelled like the change of season. Harriet was helping Ruth close up the boarding house kitchen when one of Grant's hired men burst through the door, breathless, looking for the sheriff, saying that a fire had broken out at the Barnett place, and it was spreading fast toward the barn. Harriet did not wait for the sheriff. She grabbed her shawl and ran into the street, flagging down the first wagon she saw, which happened to belong to the blacksmith, a broad, quiet man named Otis Prout who took one look at her face and did not ask a single question before whipping his horses toward the Barnett ranch. The fire, when they arrived, was a wall of orange light against the black sky, eating through the dry grass of the north pasture and licking dangerously close to the barn where 12 horses were screaming in their stalls. Wallace was already there, soot-streaked and half-choking on smoke, hauling buckets of water from the well with a desperation that told Harriet he was thinking less about the barn than about the animals trapped inside it. "The horses," she shouted, already running toward the barn doors. "Wallace, get the horses out first. The barn does not matter, the horses matter." He looked at her for one startled second, as though he could not quite believe she was there, and then something in his face resolved, and he nodded, and together they threw open the stalls and drove the terrified animals out into the night, one after another, until the barn was empty and the horses were scattered safely across the south pasture, out of the fire's reach. By the time the sheriff and half the men of Willow Creek arrived with wagons and shovels and wet blankets, the fire had already begun to die against a firebreak that Wallace had dug 2 summers before, more from habit than foresight. And by dawn what remained was a blackened scar across the north pasture, and a barn with a scorched but standing frame, and 12 horses safe and accounted for in the south corral. They found the source of the fire an hour after sunrise, a trampled patch of grass near the fence line where someone had struck flint against tinder and walked away, careless or deliberate. No one could say for certain, though everyone had their suspicions, and everyone's suspicions pointed the same direction. "Grant will say it was an accident," the sheriff said, crouching by the burned patch, shaking his head. "Lightning, maybe, or a careless drifter. He will say it, and there will be no way to prove otherwise, and you know it as well as I do, Wallace." "I know it," Wallace said, and his voice was hollow with exhaustion and something else, something that sounded to Harriet's ear dangerously close to defeat. She found him an hour later sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the ruined pasture, his hands black with soot and his shoulders bowed in a way she had never seen before, not even on the day she had bandaged his sprained ankle, and she sat down beside him without asking permission because she had decided by then that some moments did not call for asking. "You saved the horses," she said. "That is what matters. The grass will grow back, Wallace. The horses would not have." "He is going to keep coming after me," Wallace said, not looking at her. "Grant will not stop. Not with fire, not with fences, not with anything until he has this land or I am dead, and I am tired, Harriet. I'm so tired of fighting this alone." It was the first time he had said her name back to her without her prompting it, and it landed in her chest like something sacred. "Then do not fight alone," she said. "I have told you that 12 times now, and you have not listened once, but I am telling you again. Let the town help you. Let the sheriff build a case. Let me help you. You do not have to carry every single thing by yourself, Wallace Barnett, no matter how much you have convinced yourself that you must." He turned to look at her then, his pale eyes rimmed red from smoke and exhaustion, and something in his face had changed, some final wall finally beginning to give way under the steady pressure she had been applying for 3 long months. "Why?" he asked, and his voice cracked on the single word. "Why do you keep fighting for me? I have given you nothing but reasons to leave." "Because," Harriet said simply, "I do not give up on people simply because they have decided the world has given up on them. My mother taught me that. And because, Wallace, somewhere between the pie and the mended shirts and the fence posts, I fell in love with you, and I am too stubborn a woman to let a little thing like your gruffness stand in the way of saying so." The words hung in the smoke-scented morning air between them, and for a long moment Wallace said nothing at all, and Harriet's heart pounded so loud she thought he must surely hear it. And then, slowly, carefully, as though he were handling something fragile that he was afraid he might break, he reached over and took her soot-stained hand in his. "I do not know how to do this," he said quietly. "I do not know how to let someone in. I have spent 5 years making sure I would never have to feel a loss like that again, and you have spent 3 months tearing that wall down brick by brick whether I wanted you to or not." "I know," Harriet said. "I noticed." "I love you too," he said, the words coming out rough and unpracticed, as though he had not said them to anyone in a very long time and had almost forgotten how the shape of them felt in his mouth. "I have for longer than I would like to admit. I told myself it did not matter, because I did not deserve to have something good after everything I lost, and because I was certain that anything good would only be taken from me again. But I am tired of believing that, Harriet. I am tired of being right about being alone." Harriet felt tears rise up hot and sudden, and she did not bother to hide them because Wallace Barnett had finally let her see behind the wall, and she was not about to pretend she felt nothing about it. "You do not have to be alone anymore," she said. "Not if you do not want to be." "I do not want to be," he said, and then, with the particular gruffness that Harriet had come to love despite herself, he added, "Though I expect you already knew that, being as stubborn as you are." "I did know it," Harriet said, laughing through her tears. "I have known it for weeks. I was simply waiting for you to catch up." He kissed her then, there on the porch steps with the smell of smoke still hanging in the air, and the ruined pasture stretching black and silent behind them. And it was not a fine or polished kiss, not the kind of kiss out of the novels Harriet had read as a girl. But it was honest, and it was real, and it tasted faintly of ash and hope, and Harriet decided it was the finest kiss she had ever received in her whole life. They did not have much time to enjoy the moment, however, because Silas Grant was not a man to be satisfied with a single failed attempt, and within the week he made his intentions plain in a manner that left no room for doubt. He rode out to the Barnett ranch himself, flanked by two of his hired men, and found Wallace and Harriet working together to rebuild the burned section of fence, and he did not bother dismounting before he spoke his piece. "Barnett," Grant said, his voice smooth and cold in the way of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through money or fear, whichever proved cheaper. "I hear you had some bad luck last week. Shame about the pasture. These things happen out here in this country. Man alone cannot always protect everything he owns." "I'm not alone," Wallace said, and Harriet felt a fierce pride swell in her chest at the way he said it, plain and unashamed, with her standing right beside him where anyone could see. Grant's eyes flicked over Harriet with a dismissiveness that made her want to slap him, though she held her tongue, because she had learned enough about men like Silas Grant to know that losing her temper would only give him satisfaction he did not deserve. "I will make you one more offer," Grant said, "and it will be my last. $400 for the north pasture and the water rights that run through it. That is more than fair, and I suggest you take it, because the next accident on this ranch might not leave you standing here to argue about it." "That is a threat," Harriet said, before Wallace could speak, because she had decided that if this man wanted to threaten someone she loved, he was going to have to do it while looking her in the eye too. "You are threatening a man in front of witnesses, Mr. Grant, and I do not believe the sheriff of this county is quite so blind as you seem to think he is." Grant's smile thinned. "I do not know who you are, miss, but I would advise you to stay out of business that does not concern you." "I am Harriet Keller," Harriet said, standing straighter, her voice ringing out clear and loud across the yard, "and I intend to become Harriet Barnett before the month is out, which makes this ranch and everything on it very much my concern. And I will tell you plainly, Mr. Grant, that if one more fire, one more cut fence, or one more fouled well happens on this land, I will personally ride to Bozeman and fetch a federal marshal, and I will stand in front of a judge and testify to every threat you have made in my hearing. And I do not believe your money will protect you from that quite so easily as it has protected you from the sheriff of a town too small and too frightened to stand against you." The silence that followed stretched long and taut, and Silas Grant's face went through several expressions: surprise, anger, and finally something that looked almost like grudging respect, before he wheeled his horse around without another word and rode back toward town, his men trailing behind him. Wallace stared at Harriet for a long moment after they had gone, and then unexpectedly he laughed. A real laugh, deep and surprised, the kind of laugh Harriet suspected he had not allowed himself in years. "Remind me," he said, "never to make you angry." "I am not angry," Harriet said, though her hands were still shaking with the aftermath of it. "I am protective. There is a difference, and I intend for you to learn it thoroughly, Mr. Barnett, seeing as we are apparently to be married." "Apparently," Wallace agreed, pulling her into his arms right there in the dust of the yard, "though I do not recall proposing." "You did not need to. I proposed for the both of us back there in front of Silas Grant and his hired men, which I think counts double, given the circumstances." "Then I suppose I had better not disappoint you," Wallace said, and he kissed her again, slower this time, less desperate than the first kiss on the porch steps, and full of a promise that Harriet felt settle into her bones like the first warm day after a long winter. Silas Grant did not trouble the Barnett ranch again, not directly. Word had already begun to travel through the valley about the confrontation, about the loud, fearless woman who had stood her ground against him in his own yard, and within a fortnight 2 of the other small ranchers he had been pressuring found their courage as well, banding together with Wallace to file a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Office regarding the water rights dispute, backed by the sheriff's own written account of the fire and the threats that had preceded it. Grant, unwilling to risk the scrutiny of federal authorities poking into his affairs, quietly withdrew his interest in the North Pasture altogether, and though he remained the largest rancher in the valley, he never again dared to send fire or cut fence toward the Barnett land. Wallace and Harriet were married on the second Saturday of October, in the little church with the cracked bell, which the congregation had finally raised enough money to replace that very week, so that the bell rang clear and true for the first time in years as the two of them walked out of the church as husband and wife. Eleanor Barnett, Wallace's sister, traveled 2 days by coach from Helena to attend, arriving with tears in her eyes and an expression of such enormous satisfaction that Wallace accused her, only half joking, of having planned the whole thing from the very beginning. "I did not plan the fire," Eleanor said primly, embracing Harriet after the ceremony, "though I will admit I hoped for something dramatic enough to knock some sense into my brother's thick skull. I am glad it was you who came, Harriet Keller. I wrote to a dozen women before you, and not one of them had the backbone to stay after the first letter he sent refusing them." "He did not refuse me," Harriet said, laughing, glancing over at Wallace, who stood nearby looking faintly embarrassed by the entire conversation. "He simply had not yet realized he wanted to say yes." Ruth Calloway hosted the wedding supper at the boarding house, with half the town crowded into the dining room and spilling out onto the porch, and Otis Prout the blacksmith brought his fiddle, and there was dancing late into the evening under a sky thick with autumn stars. Harriet danced with Wallace first, of course, though he protested that he had not danced since he was a boy and had no notion how to do it properly, and Harriet told him that she did not care one bit how properly he did it, only that he did it with her, and by the third song he had loosened enough to laugh again, twice, which the whole town noted with considerable astonishment, because Wallace Barnett laughing twice in one evening was rarer than snow in July. They moved into the ranch house together that same week, and Harriet set about making it a home in earnest curtains in the windows, a garden turned for spring planting, a rocking chair on the porch where the two of them took to sitting together in the evenings, watching the horses graze in the pasture that had long since grown back green over the scorched earth. Wallace remained, in many ways, exactly the man Harriet had met that first hot June morning, gruff in his manner, sparing with his words, more comfortable with a rope in his hands than with company at supper. But the walls he had built had come down, brick by brick, and what remained underneath was steady, and devoted and deeply, quietly loving in the way of a man who had learned, at great cost, exactly how precious it was to have someone who refused to leave. Winter came hard that year, as it always did in that country, and Harriet learned what it meant to be a rancher's wife, in truth learned to break ice on the water troughs before dawn, learned to help birth a foal in the dead of a January night when the mare's labor turned difficult, learned that love in that harsh, beautiful country was often measured less in soft words than in the simple, steady fact of showing up, day after day, no matter the weather. Wallace taught her to ride properly that winter, patient in a way she had not expected from a man so short on patience for most everything else, and Harriet in turn taught him slowly that it was safe to speak his mind to someone who was not going to use his words against him or leave because of them. By spring, Harriet was certain she was carrying their first child, and when she told Wallace, standing in the kitchen with flour still on her hands from the morning's baking, He went very still and very quiet in a way that frightened her for one brief moment, until she saw the wetness gathering in his eyes and understood that his stillness was not distance but overwhelming feeling, the kind he had not yet learned how to voice aloud. "A child," he said finally, his voice thick. "Ours." "Ours," Harriet confirmed, and then, because she could not help herself even in so tender a moment, she added, "And I expect it will be as loud and stubborn as its mother, so you had best prepare yourself now, Wallace Barnett." "Good," he said, pulling her into his arms with a gentleness that still, after all these months, sometimes surprised her, coming from a man built like a mountain. "This ranch could use a bit more noise in it. It was too quiet before you came." Their son was born in November of 1883, a healthy boy with his father's storm-gray eyes, and from the very first week, his mother's considerable set of lungs, which Wallace claimed, with the dry humor Harriet had slowly coaxed out of him over their year of marriage, was proof enough of whose child he truly was. They named him Thomas, after Wallace's father, and Harriet watched with a fullness in her heart she had never known before as Wallace held the boy for the first time, his big rough hands so careful, so impossibly gentle, cradling the small life that represented everything he had once believed he would never let himself have again. A daughter followed 2 years later, in the autumn of 1885, whom they named Eleanor after Wallace's sister, and by then the Barnett Ranch had grown into one of the finest horse operations in the valley, its herds strong and its pastures green, its water rights secure, its owner known throughout the county not merely as a gruff and solitary man, but as Wallace Barnett, husband to Harriet, father to Thomas and Eleanor, a man whose quiet steadiness had become, in its own way, as respected as his wife's famous refusal to ever, under any circumstances, back down from a fight worth fighting. Harriet never did entirely cure Wallace of his gruffness, nor did she try in the end, because she had come to understand that the gruffness and the quiet and the stubborn, impossible nature of him were simply the shape his love took before he learned better words for it, and that underneath all of it had always been a man capable of tremendous tenderness, waiting only for someone patient enough, and loud enough, and undeterred enough to draw it out into the light. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, they sat together on the porch as the sun went down gold and orange over the ridge, Thomas chasing fireflies in the yard below and baby Eleanor asleep against her mother's shoulder. And Wallace reached over and took Harriet's hand the way he had that first smoke-stained morning after the fire, and said, in the same rough, unpracticed voice he had used to tell her he loved her for the very first time, "I used to think I did not deserve any of this. I used to think the safest thing a man could do, after losing everyone he loved, was make sure he never had anything left to lose again. And now?" Harriet asked, though she already knew the answer because she had watched it grow in him, season after season, ever since that first pie left uneaten on the porch rail had come back to her scrubbed clean and full of quiet, unspoken gratitude. "Now I think," Wallace said, watching their son laugh in the fading light, feeling the warm weight of his sleeping daughter against his wife's shoulder, "that the bravest thing a man can do is let someone stubborn enough love him anyway." Harriet leaned her head against his shoulder, listening to the horses settling for the night in the pasture beyond, the same pasture that had once burned black under a September sky and had grown back green and whole, the way so much of Wallace himself had grown back green and whole under her steady, undeterred patience. "I was always going to love you anyway," she said softly. "You never really had a choice in the matter, Wallace Barnett. You only had a choice in how long you were going to fight it." "I fought it for 3 months," Wallace said, and for the first time in the 5 years Harriet had known him, she heard something in his voice that sounded entirely, wholly at peace. "It is the only fight in my whole life. I am glad I lost." The bell in the little church in Willow Creek rang out faintly on the evening air, calling no one to anything in particular, simply marking the hour the way it had every evening since the town had raised the money to replace it, and Harriet Keller Barnett sat on the porch of the ranch she had once walked 4 dusty miles to reach, uninvited and undeterred, and thought that she had never in her whole life heard a sweeter sound, nor found a truer home than the one she had built, brick by stubborn brick, beside a gruff and quiet man who had needed, more than anything, someone patient enough to stay. They raised their children on that ranch through the years that followed, and two more after Thomas and Elena Ray's second son, named Walter, born in 1888, sturdy and serious like his father, and a youngest daughter named Ruth, born in 1891, and named for the sharp-eyed widow who had given Harriet a room and a friend on that very first dusty afternoon so many years before. The ranch prospered, weathering droughts and hard winters the way all ranches in that country did, through steady work and steadier love, and Wallace Barnett, who had once believed himself destined to end his days alone and unremarked upon in a quiet house on a quiet ridge, instead grew old surrounded by the loud, warm, undeterred family that his wife had refused from the very first hour to let him live without. And on winter evenings, when the wind howled down off the ridge and the snow piled deep against the fences, the Barnett children would beg their mother to tell the story of how she had come to Willow Creek expecting a husband and found instead a man determined to send her away, and how she had simply refused to go, walking those 4 dusty miles again and again, pie after pie, mended shirt after mended shirt, until the gruffest, quietest, most impossible man in the whole Montana territory had finally, helplessly and completely fallen in love with her instead. And that, Harriet would always finish, glancing over at her husband where he sat by the fire, watching her with the same quiet, storm-gray tenderness he had carried in his eyes every day since that morning after the fire, is how your father learned that some things in this world are worth being impossible to move for, and that some people are simply too stubborn and too patient and too completely undeterred to ever let you win. She is right, Wallace would say every single time, reaching for her hand across the space between their chairs. I never stood a chance. And outside, the Montana wind would go on blowing across the ranch that had become, against every expectation Wallace Barnett had once held about his own life, the truest and warmest home either of them had ever known, built not on the easy foundation of two people who had simply agreed to love each other, but on the harder, richer ground of one woman's refusal to give up on a man who had, for a long time, forgotten how to believe he was worth staying for. It was, Harriet often thought, exactly the kind of love story her mother had always promised her existed, out there somewhere in the wide, hard, beautiful country beyond St. Louis. Not soft, not easy, not without its share of smoke and fire and threats from men like Silas Grant, but true and steady and entirely, gloriously hers. And so it remained for all the many good years that followed, on a ranch beneath a low ridge in the Montana Territory, where a gruff man and a loud woman had once stood facing each other in a dusty yard, each entirely certain of exactly how that first conversation would end, and each of them, as it turned out, wonderfully, completely wrong.